Hi, my name is Ryan James Whitehouse, or if you want, you can call me Crew Jaem. I'm going to introduce you to the IELTS Writing Task 1 academic test. You may already know from the booklet that you need to write at least 150 words, and you need to do that within 20 minutes. There are a whole range of different question types that you need to be able to practice with in order to prepare for the test. So I'm going to very quickly introduce you to each type of diagram. The first one that's on your screen right now is a process diagram. The next one below that is a diagram of a map or two maps. And then on the top part of the screen in the middle, you have an illustration of a line graph. And then we have a bar graph with a table. After that, we have a pie graph. And then at the lower end of the screen, you've got a pie graph with a table. So there are, generally speaking, 6 different types of diagrams in the IELTS Writing Task 1 academic test, but you could also get a combination of questions. So you may get, for example, a pie graph and a table together, or you might get a bar graph and a table together, or a line graph and a table together, or you may get a mixture of other statistical diagrams, for example, a line graph and a bar graph together. The main objective is for you to understand the grammar that's unique to each type of diagram and use that as the content of your written response. And it will also help you to brainstorm what information in the diagram to talk about. That will also help you to manage your time a little bit better as well. Over the next 2 slides, I'm going to be introducing to you the process diagram as well as the map. The content that I'm going to be talking about will include some of the basic grammar and essential terminology that you should be using for both types of diagrams. And I'll also refer to, in some detail, how you should format your response as well. So let's begin. The description of a process diagram can be incredibly difficult for a lot of people, particularly if we don't know the purpose or the objective of this particular type of diagram. So I'm going to very briefly give an overview of what you need to do in order to accomplish a high score. And I'm also going to explain grammatically in terms of tenses and some of the unique grammar, as well as the vocabulary and terminology that you should use in order to increase your score. The purpose of a process diagram is to explain what is happening in each step, and to explain that by using a wide range of different verbs. So we'll be thinking about tenses now. We primarily want to use the present tenses, for example, the present simple, as well as the present perfect tense. These 2 tense forms, present simple and the present perfect, are incredibly important, mainly because we want to look at the illustration and say factually what happens. So the present simple tense is suitable for this description. When we think about the perfect tense, we use that whenever we want to talk about sequential stages or steps 1 and 2, for example, after and before, for instance. So the present simple and the present perfect tense forms are the tenses that you should use when you're describing the process diagram. In terms of the unique grammar that you should use every now and then, not all the time, would be a mix of the active voice as well as the passive voice. So there's some advanced grammar as well. In addition to that, you want to be thinking about terminology. So terminology would focus primarily around words that describe going from step 1 to step 2, and then step 3, and then step 4, until the final step. So you'll be using words such as initially, and then, after that, before, next, subsequently, finally, for example. Of course, in the IELTS Academic Writing Task 1, whatever diagram you get in the test, you should have a mix of simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences as well as maybe a couple, maybe even one compound and complex sentence, because those sentences are quite long. You don't want to have too many. In addition to that, you could also use expressions. For example, in the first stage, following this, for instance, you want to use adjectives to describe what you see in each step. In addition to this, you also want to paraphrase a lot of words that are in the illustration as well. For example, in step 1, for the sugarcane production, you can see the gerund growing. Well, you could change growing to infinitive instead. For example, to grow. In step 2, harvesting, we could change that to harvest, for instance. So everything that I've explained so far will help you to get more than 7.0, but you do need to make sure that you follow through with explaining every single step. The purpose of a map is to describe 1, what has changed, 2, where that change has occurred, and 3, how has it changed. So when we are thinking about what has changed, we will take nouns from the illustration. For example, school, that has changed in this illustration of Norbiton Industrial Area. And if we need to talk about where, we could say towards the eastern part of the city or of the area. The next part would be how. How can we describe this change? Well, we can see, looking at the diagram, that a school will be constructed. So there'll be a development, a school will be built. A basic sentence in the IELTS Writing Task 1 map description would be towards the eastern part of Norbiton Industrial Area, there will be constructed a large school. Or you could say a large school will be constructed towards the eastern part of Norbiton Industrial Area, for instance. Naturally, of course, in terms of the grammar, tenses, for instance, that would depend on the time in the description. For example, in the diagram here, we have the keywords now in the title of the top diagram and future development down the bottom. So we know that we should be using future tenses, future simple, future continuous, when we want to describe features in the bottom picture. And if we describe something in the top picture, we want to use the present simple tense or even the present perfect tense. Some of the key terminology that you want to use in the description of a map would be prepositions of location. So you might say towards the east, or in the eastern part of the city, for example, in the northern area, towards the northeastern area of the city, comma, subject, verb, object, for instance. You can also use other prepositions of location, for example, opposite the hospital, across the river, near the farmland, for instance. So these will be keywords to help you increase your score for lexical resource as well as for coherency. But I also would like to recommend using vocabulary suitable for the topic as well. So you'll be thinking of adjectives to describe the change, to improve the clarity of how this change has occurred over time. In the description of a line graph, you'd need to focus on deciding what type of trend you need to use. But if it is between, for example, 2020 and 2023, that whole period of 3 years would primarily be described by using the continuous tense. Obviously, it's in the past, so you'd need to use the past continuous tenses. In the description of a bar graph, the main grammar here would be focusing on comparative language. So you might need to use such information as higher than, lower than, highest or lowest, for example. The same also applies to the description of a table. However, once we move to a pie graph description, the type of grammar is actually quite simple. It's quite straightforward. However, you would need to focus on using quite a lot of the comparative language, superlative adjectives, comparative adjectives, such as bigger than, larger than, smaller than, biggest proportion, smallest slice, for instance. This would be suitable for a description of a pie graph. In the description of each of these types of diagrams, one of the most important things would also be, in addition to the grammar, the terminology that you need to use as well. For example, in a line graph, you'd need to use such words as peak, for instance, or you might want to use fluctuation as well. So these two words are very unique to the description of a line graph. Therefore, you should use it in the brainstorm part of identifying features that you need to talk about. What part of a line graph, in this particular line graph, for example, in your test, what part of it is fluctuating? Talk about that. Which is the highest point? Which is the lowest point? Talk about that. In the description of a bar graph, the same thing also applies. The highest and the lowest points, and points that are similar, for example. In the description of a pie graph, naturally you want to be comparing information. What proportion is similar to another year? For example, it might be the proportion of males in a high school in 2020 compared to the proportion of males in 2022. For instance, they might be the same or larger or smaller. Naturally, you'll talk about that sort of information as well. How do we know what to talk about in the description of a Writing Task 1 statistical diagram? Well, there are 4 different types of statistical diagrams in the IELTS Writing Task 1 academic test. We have the line graph, the bar graph, the pie graph, and the table. But in terms of the content, it's all the same. We must describe what we're talking about, the group, for example, males and females, for instance. We need to use some kind of verb or adjective to describe the trend, increasing, decreasing, rising, falling, for example. We need to have some kind of information about the data, from 10% to 20%, for example. And then finally, if it's a line graph, for example, we need to always give some information about the time. So you might say, for instance, between 2011 and 2012. When you describe a line graph, it's important to talk about changes over a period of time. Talking about trends would be essential for the description of a line graph. So in order to do that, you need to think deeply about what tense you should be using. So in the illustration that you have on your screen, the number of shop closures and openings between 2011 and 2018, the tense that we should use would primarily be the past tense. So whatever feature we talk about in the illustration, we should be using the past tense. But you should also think about the tense form as well. So for line graph, you should use the continuous tense as well as the perfect tense as well. So past continuous and the past perfect would be essential, perhaps used at least once in your written response. Don't forget the content that you should be using in your written response as well. GTDT, group, trend, data, and time. For example, you might say the amount of store closures was decreasing from roughly 6,500 to 700 between 2014 and 2015, for instance. Take note of the expressions of time that you can use. You might use such words as from 2014 to 2015 or between 2014 and 2015. If you're talking about one moment in time, then you might just say the highest point of openings in 2011 had 8,500 new stores, for example. So here we have an instance where I've only talked about one time, 1 year. In that case, I've used the word or the preposition in. Take note that you also want to use conjunctions in order to increase your score so that you're using compound sentences and but, for example, or subordinating conjunctions such as after, before, while, or when, for instance. The terminology that you can use for a line graph will help you to identify necessary features to talk about. For example, peak, P-E-A-K, or stable or fluctuation. These are 3 words that you should use in your written response of a line graph because they are unique to this type of diagram. So in terms of identifying main features, again, look for the highest point, look for the lowest point, look for a group or a period of time where there's lots of fluctuation or stability. Mention them, and then after that, talk about other changes, other trends as well. In the description of a bar graph and a table, the grammar is actually very similar, in fact, probably exactly the same. However, you would need to focus primarily on comparative sentences such as more than, higher than, lower than, for example. Superlative adjectives and comparative adjectives are essential grammar for this type of description. Whenever we see 2 diagrams together, for example, a bar graph and a table together, again, we still need to understand the difference between them. Typically with a bar graph, we're still talking about trends, but normally a trend is not illustrated in the description of a table. That is to say, we don't use a table or tables to describe trends. We could use other methods, for example, line graph, a bar graph, a pie graph, for example, or even a bar graph. So you wouldn't use a table to describe changes or trends. However, what you'll frequently find is that a table often accompanies another diagram, for example, a bar graph and a table together. So you want to look at what's different between the two. For example, in this diagram, you can see that the bar graph is measured in billions of dollars. In the description of the table, it describes percentage changes. So you might say, for instance, the export earnings of petroleum products increased from roughly $61 billion to around $63 billion, which is a rise of 3%. So the purpose of the table here is just to tell us that it's increased by a certain percentage and not dollars. You could add that information into your sentence, or you could just talk about the increase or the decrease in the billions of dollars. But in order to get your score higher, in order to increase your score, you could create a relative clause by saying the earnings of petroleum products increased from roughly $61 billion to around $63 billion, comma, which had been or which was a rise of 3%. The description of a pie graph is also quite straightforward. If you've understood the content so far, then with the pie graph, you would be using, again, quite a lot of comparative language. However, you'll be focusing more on superlative adjectives, biggest or smallest, plus a noun. So the biggest proportion or the smallest slice, for instance. In terms of terminology, proportion and slice are 2 words that you should use in the description of a pie graph. Furthermore, you'll also want to be using approximations. However, the approximations in a pie graph could be, instead of 25%, you might say a quarter. Instead of 50%, you might say a half, for example. And if you come across percentages where it's a little bit above 50% or a little bit below 25%, you might say, for example, just under a quarter with 24%. Or if it's 51%, you might say just over a half with 51%, for instance. So with the description of a pie graph, a lot of the grammar is quite similar to a table and a bar graph as well, except the type of grammar that we're going to be using now would focus primarily on superlative adjectives and changing percentages to fractions and using approximations such as just under or just over, because we can't say approximately or roughly in the description of a pie graph because the data is very clearly written for us. So therefore, with a pie graph, it should be a lot easier than the other diagrams. Focus on a lot of comparative language, but also make sure you understand a couple of terms such as proportion and slice when you're talking about a group or a category. In addition to that, you also want to be focusing on approximations as well, such as just over a half, just over a half, just under a half, just under a quarter, just over a quarter, for instance. In terms of the format and structure of your written response, the first paragraph should include an introduction and a brief overview. The second paragraph should include perhaps similarities, and in the third paragraph, you should include differences or comparisons. So everything that's similar or rising could be in the second paragraph, and everything that's very different, decreasing, for example, could be in your third paragraph. In the introduction, you might say, for instance, the paragraph provides a visual illustration of export earnings in 2015 and 2016 period. After that, you'd provide some kind of overview, and this could include comparative language, higher than, more than, less than, not as high as, or as high as, for example, as comparative language. But for an overview in a statistical diagram, you should not include any specific information, for example, 10% or $5 billion. So no data in the overview of your written response. As you move to your second paragraph and your third paragraph, the main grammar should focus on comparative language, higher than, less than, taller than, lower than, for example, or not as plus adjective plus as, or as plus adjective plus as again, and the remainder of your sentence. When you're talking about the content of a statistical diagram, the features that you've chosen, again, you should mention the group name, for example, petroleum products. You want to talk about the trend, increased or decreased, for example. Then you want to talk about the data. So you might say, for instance, from around $61 billion to roughly $63 billion. Then you could also add some information about the time in 2015 and 2016, for instance. In this description, you can see that we have a table as well. So you might add more information to the content of your written response. So you might say a rise of 3%. So your full sentence could include, for example, the export earnings of petroleum products had risen from roughly $61 billion to $63 billion in 2015 and 2016, comma, which was a rise of 3%. So in terms of multiple diagrams like this, where we have a bar graph and a table together, you could also include an introduction for the table in your introduction as well as the overview paragraph. So that will help you to just briefly introduce the information from the bar graph and the table. Try to keep it short whenever you have two diagrams that are different, because then your introductory paragraph might end up being quite long, and you don't want that. Focus on having a short introduction and overview, but for the body paragraphs, make them longer. In a writing task 1 response, structure plays a crucial role in achieving a high score. First, you must combine the introduction and overview in a single paragraph. The introduction should provide a brief description of the diagram, while the overview should offer a general summary of the key points or stages. This combined approach is essential. Without it, your score will not exceed 5.0. Next, in the body paragraphs, you'll focus on the specific details of the diagram. For a single diagram, this is usually split into 2 paragraphs. In the first paragraph, you explain the main features, steps, or trends, while in the second paragraph, you continue to cover any additional details. So, remember, begin with an introduction and overview together, followed by a clear breakdown of the details. Be sure to describe each step in a process diagram, but when working with other diagrams, focus only on the key features. In an IELTS Writing Task 1 multiple diagram, it's essential to start with an introduction and overview in the first paragraph. And you'd clearly need to provide a general summary of the introduction as well as the overview for both diagrams. Here's an example. The bar graph and table provide a visual representation of one country's export revenue in 2015 and 2016 across 5 product categories. Overall, it can be seen that the revenue received from exported items was higher in 2016 than in the previous year, and petroleum-related commodities were the most profitable. In the first body paragraph, focus on the main trends or increases. For instance, describe the significant rise in export earnings for engineered goods, which increased from around $58 billion to $61 billion in 2016. This would highlight a clear upward trend. In the second body paragraph, you'll focus on decreases or more stable trends. For example, mention how petroleum products showed a modest increase from $60 billion to $63 billion, and agricultural products had a negligible growth of just 0.81%. One of the main goals of 2 diagrams in one test, a multiple diagram such as what you see on your screen right now, is to compare the diagrams. So you should have a third body paragraph. This could be as short as you need it to be. And in the final body paragraph, it's useful to compare both diagrams by describing their relationship. For example, it's interesting to note that while gems and jewelry experienced a slight decrease in earnings, textiles showed the highest growth with a 15.24% increase. Remember, each diagram requires both an introduction and an overview. Then use the body paragraphs to break down the trends and compare the diagrams when appropriate. Keeping your response clear and concise will help you score much higher. In IELTS Writing Task 1, the grammar you use depends on the type of diagram. For example, processes require the passive voice. Maps typically need 2 tenses and prepositions of location, such as to the left or in the past. Bar graphs and tables focus on comparative language, such as more than or less than. Line graphs use continuous and perfect tenses, along with specific terminology. Pie charts, on the other hand, need proportional language, for example, 1/3 or a quarter. And multiple diagrams emphasize relationships between the data. Don't forget that to score well, mix the active and passive voices together, use comparatives, adjectives, and adverbs, and ensure that you use correct punctuation. Remember to use proportionate language and vary your sentence structures. Always remember to tailor your grammar to each type of diagram. For example, comparatives are key for maps, while superlatives are less common. Focus on the right grammar for each question to improve your score. In IELTS Writing Task 1, using the correct grammar structures is essential for clarity and accuracy. So let's go over some of the key grammar points. The adjective plus noun, for example, a sudden rise or a drastic increase, requires that adjectives modify nouns to describe specific qualities or characteristics. On the other hand, adverbs plus verbs, for example, suddenly rising or moderately increased, these adverbs modify verbs to show how, when, or to what extent something happens. We also have approximation plus data as well. Words like roughly, around, or approximately are used to indicate estimated quantities or time frames, whereas comparative adjectives plus a noun, for example, bigger slice or smaller proportion, these are used to compare two or more things so that we can understand which one is higher or lower in degree. Comparative sentences, for example, the proportion of males is larger than females, helps us to compare, again, quantities or qualities. Don't forget that correct punctuation is essential, so use commas to separate items in lists or clauses, and a semicolon to correctly close related independent clauses. For example, the data shows a clear trend, semicolon, there is a significant increase in production. The passive voice is also important. For example, is harvested or are demolished. The passive voice focuses on the action or the recipient, not, in fact, the doer. Proportionate language plus of plus a noun, for example, 1/3, 2/3, or a quarter, shows parts of a whole. We also have the superlative adjective plus a noun, for example, largest proportion. These superlative adjectives are used to indicate the highest or lowest degree among a certain group. Don't forget to also make sure your sentences are well varied. Use compound sentences to join two independent clauses together, or complex sentences where we also have dependent clauses. For example, the study focused on demographic changes, comma, and the results were surprising. This would be a compound sentence. Or, although the economy faced challenges, comma, the government's intervention significantly improved conditions. This is an example of a complex sentence. So mastering these grammatical structures will help you clearly describe data and trends, which is, of course, essential for a high score in IELTS Writing Task 1. In your IELTS Writing Task 1 response, there are several sentence patterns you can use for statistical diagrams, but these structures are not necessary for a process diagram. So let's go through the four main patterns that are commonly used in bar graphs, line graphs, pie charts, and tables. First, comparing two things, you'll need to use the sentence pattern, noun plus verb plus comparative adjective plus than plus a noun again. For example, in 2016, the value of petroleum products was higher than in 2015. This structure compares two things, showing how one is greater or lesser than the other. Next, comparing the highest or lowest, you would need to use the sentence pattern, noun plus verb plus the plus superlative adjective plus noun. For example, the earnings of petroleum products were the highest. This structure is used to highlight the most or least in a category. Number 3, comparing unequal things would require the use of the sentence pattern, noun plus verb plus not as, plus adjective plus as plus noun. For example, in 2016, the value of gems and jewelry was not as high as in 2015. This structure compares two things that are not equal in value or amount. Finally, in number 4, comparing equal things. You would need to use the sentence pattern, noun plus verb plus adjective plus as plus noun. For example, in 2015, the earnings of agricultural products were as high as in 2016.
This structure compares two things that are equal or similar in value. Remember, these sentence patterns are perfect for comparing data in statistical diagrams. However, for process diagrams, these structures are not necessary. Instead, focus on describing the steps or stages of the process clearly and logically.
Well, that brings us to the end of our quick IELTS program together. I hope that your journey with me has not only been valuable, but also enjoyable as well. Believe it or not, I actually began recording our sessions together in Chiang Mai, Thailand. I'm now here in Auckland, New Zealand, and it's Christmas time. So I'd like to wish you all a very Merry Christmas. And in a couple of days' time, it will be New Year's. So I hope you all have a wonderful New Year's together with your family and friends as well. If you haven't already, feel free to contact us via the Facebook Messenger application and make sure you register for our program. Generally, our prices are really competitive and you can study for 12 months in our live classes. Again, I'd like to thank you all and all the luck in the world to you for your IELTS test. Thank you and see you again soon.